Hello, everyone. Welcome to, well, we usually say which number of the episode of Free Kiwis.
14,
I think it is episode 14 of Free Kiwis. But I think we should also use our slogan. Free Kiwis is a podcast for free Kiwi thinking and new New Zealand ideas. So it took me a long time to think up that slogan, so we better use it. Okay, so today we have a very special guest who is Professor Jamin Halberstadt of the University of Otago. He is a psychology professor, and if you glance at his academic staff page at Otago, you'll see that he's published a little bit more than me. Lots of papers, lots of studies, and the flow keeps coming. And he's looked at a number of very interesting areas in psychology, including emotion and cognition and the interplay between the two, including, I believe, in religious contexts. So we're going to get into that later on. But actually, I wanted to start off with another topic, and I know that you've done some work on human attractiveness. And of course, this is an issue that that interests all of us, at least at some point in our lives.
Whether we admit it or not.
Whether we admit it or not. So I wonder if you could just start off by telling me, maybe just sort of sketching out what have studies of human attractiveness suggested or shown, and where does your own work fit into that literature?
Sure. Well, thanks a lot for having me on the show. I have one of my dreams is to run my own podcast someday. So this is my first time actually being a guest on one. So you're asking about attractiveness. So well, I should mention, I guess first, I do research in lots and lots of diverse and odd areas. The oddest of which probably never have gotten published. But for the most part, especially recently, I've sort of followed my own students' sort of interests. My own experience or my own background is in social cognition, which is kind of a cross between social psychology and cognitive psychology. So it's looking at various topics that would generally fall under the domain of social psychology, but at a kind of a very kind of low level usually. So it's usually there's no social stuff going on. There are no sometimes there aren't even people involved, but there's very rarely groups of people. It's usually individuals working on computers where we're measuring their response times or individual responses and try to model them and try to predict how they would behave in some socially relevant situation. So just that as an aside. So I guess I'm saying I'm not really an expert on anything in particular. So please.
We'll definitely come back to that social cognition stuff. I mean, my background is cognitive psychology more squarely, yeah. So we can have some good conversations about that. But in terms of the attractiveness thing, when you have been working in that area, are you approaching it also from a cognitive perspective, doing the sorts of studies where you might show faces on a screen and people rate them or respond to them in some way? Is that the kind of...
Yeah, exactly. So my own interest in attractiveness actually comes from there's a particular phenomenon known as what we coined it's called the averageness in attractiveness effect, which is a term I don't actually like very much. But it just refers to the preference for examples that are good members of their groups. So in the attractiveness literature generally, which I'm not as expert on, there's a ton of research on what makes people attractive, and of course there's a lot of individual differences and there's a lot of cultural differences that you can read about. There are some supposedly cultural universals that are sort of gendered, like I know I've heard in very general terms that heterosexual women prefer heterosexual men with like strong jaw lines, and heterosexual men prefer women with high cheekbones and like youthful appearance, and these are all always related back to evolutionary psychological theories in one form or another. So all these features are supposedly signaling in some way that the person is a good mate in some way.
I've heard symmetry is some sort of a universal. Is that the case, or?
Symmetry is attractive, but it's also overlaps with with other sort of related features. In fact, it overlaps with this averageness phenomenon that I've studied. So it's actually I think it was Francis Galton who first demonstrated that if you take faces and you kind of overlap them and create kind of a composite, what we call now like a morphed face, you get a face that people think that looks more attractive than the originals. So he was doing this. I think this was part of his eugenics work, actually. Doesn't have like the best history, but he sort of was a pioneer in sort of morphing faces, like at the beginning of photography, really. So he's taking plates and taking like known criminals and like combining 10 people who've been arrested for theft to see if you get a face that is, if you can sort of identify the typical thief's face, by layering all these people on top of each other. And as far as I know, he doesn't find anything like that, but he does note that the resulting combinations are more attractive than the originals. And then if you sort of fast forward to, I don't know, like 1980s or 90s, you have people are using morphing technology to kind of and discovering the same phenomenon that if you take faces and you kind of blend them together to create a kind of an average of the two or four or however many faces you want, the face gets sort of more attractive the more faces you have in the composite.
That's it's sort of counterintuitive in a way, because I mean, one might think, well, if you looked at the distribution of all of those features singly, and you're taking the average of each one and putting that together into a composite face in terms of its width and height and nose length and all the rest of it, then what you're doing is actually honing in, as you say, on the average, whereas we might think being exceptionally attractive is something that would be an outlier in a distribution, whereas what you're saying is actually the middle of all of the distributions you can think of is actually the most attractive place to be.
Well, I wouldn't quite go that far. I don't know if it's the most attractive place to be for everyone. I mean, this is sort of averaging across raters. Like I guess I'd say if you had to bet on, if you had to predict who would get the overall average, the mean highest attractive ratings, you would look for average face. But of course, there are going to be these idiosyncratic differences. And this is what everybody says when I talk about this stuff, that they're, what about, Julia Roberts has like a big, lips or whatever, and so has like big eyes, and isn't that really distinctive and really attractive? And of course, there are these individual kind of people who have these special features. But on the whole, it's not really distinctive features that make people attractive. I think it's really the lack of distinctive features. In fact, like distinctive, if you highlight people's distinctive features, that's what you're basically doing, is making a caricature of them. Like that's what a caricature is. It's you compare a person's face to kind of the average face, and you figure out what makes that person distinctive, and you enhance those features. So when you get your caricature drawn, at a fair or something, you look more like you, but a much less attractive version of you.
We're talking about facial attractiveness here, though, right? Because there are some components of attractiveness, for example, height in men, or even to move outside of physical attractiveness, wealth, that they seem to just keep going up, don't they? I mean, I think that after a certain point, you get too tall, and then the attractiveness starts to go down a bit. But do you ever become too wealthy? I don't know.
I don't know.
I mean, that's just to say that, it's not, you're not taking an average of all components of attractiveness. We're just focusing on facial cues here, right?
Yeah, I mean, that's what I've studied with regard to human faces, but I actually do think this is a more general phenomenon, that the sort of morphing effect with faces is just a special case of the appeal of the kind of central tendency of categories. So I'd say, if anything, that was probably more my contribution than the facial attractiveness stuff. It's like it's to see that, or to argue that, facial morphs are a special case of the central tendency of categories. So if you look at, so we've done studies where people rate how appealing, let's say a whole bunch of different birds are, and you find, that the, sparrow is like among the most attractive birds, and, an ostrich or penguin are like among the least attractive birds. And you find this for like all sorts of different categories. It's like the extreme examples that people find, both atypical and also like unappealing on the whole.
So if things are near category boundaries, they're less appealing than if they're typical exemplars.
Well, it doesn't have to be at the boundary, but far from the central tendency. Like the distance from the central tendency predicts the
right. I mean, I guess in the case of birds, you're talking about birds as a category. So you're not looking at something that's sort of morphing between a bird and a dog or something like that.
Yeah.
And I guess the same is true of faces, in as much as there's one category, which is face. And so what you're saying is that we average all those features. So it's not categories per se, but just being a typical exemplar. Have you done or has anybody done any work where they look at how attractiveness falls away as you adjust particular parameters away from that central tendency? So, and I'm wondering if whether if you just varied one parameter in an extreme way, that would end up being less attractive than it would if you varied a number of parameters more moderately. I mean, my intuition is that would be true, but
I don't know of a study like that, but I do. That is really interesting. I mean, I do think that categories, of course, are really context specific. So you can. I mean, we have done studies where you kind of manipulate the category boundaries, I guess, not manipulating individual features, but manipulating sort of the salience, I guess, of categories, of what categories are being used. I mean, I think that would be that's one of the more interesting things. This is how it sort of ties into social psychology, I guess, that people especially are, but everything is sort of multiply categorizable. So, when, Donald Trump is, maybe a terrible example of a president, but Donald Trump's a great example of, because he's very atypical of American presidents, but maybe he's a great example of a TV star or something. So you might imagine that when you're judging sort of how appealing he is, he fits well into one category, but sort of he's in the sort of extremes of another category.
I guess one category that's particularly salient for humans is, sex or gender, and so the average of the average female face would obviously be different than the average male face. So what happens if you just average faces in general, male and female? So you've got a composite human face. How does that compare with the average male face and the average female face? And presumably that might depend on who's doing the rating, whether it's male raters or female raters if they're heterosexual.
Yeah, I know that's we have a study on that sort of. I mean, we were looking at whether morphed faces, blends. These are gender blends, so they're blends of at least physically looking typically male and typically female faces. Actually, ironically, the study hasn't aged very well because now it's you wouldn't you probably wouldn't run a study where you just sort of present faces and describe them as categorically male or female, because like in gender identity, makes a difference now too. So, but in the old days anyway, we had we just presented like faces that most people would recognize as female, most people recognize as typically physically male, and these were blended together as morphs, and we asked people to judge the attractiveness of the blends. Presented, might have, I can't remember, something like 50 or 100 different blends from, sort of a 100% male to 100% female. So when you do that, you see there's actually a femininity preference, which has been documented before. People like generally in that context, they generally find the more feminized faces more attractive, as a roughly linear function of how much female features are in the are in the face.
And that's irrespective of the gender and sexuality of the raters? Or?
We have looked at that, but I can't remember the results. But I guess they weren't noteworthy enough to include in the paper. So I guess so. But the interesting thing is just that that's what you do. That's what happens if you don't do any kind of classification. But if you ask people before they rate the attractiveness to sort of force them to decide, is this person male or female, you get this big sort of inverted U dip in the middle of the morph continuum. So people in that case, people really don't like the blends very much. So my interpretation of that is that when you sort of force the category apart into two categories, and you find the blends are not very good examples of male or female, but like you're saying, they can be good examples of people.
Mm. Right. So what is it that when you're talking about these categories and contexts, what is it that sets them? Is it just your social context? So I imagine if you're born in Iceland or something, then you might think, oh, the ideal face is sort of the average Icelander. And then you go abroad and your parameters change, right, for what people look like. And so is that what's going on? And then there's another thing I'd like to throw in, if I may, which is that this is just, often when you're looking at when I look at the reports on studies of attractiveness, I just sort of compare with my intuitive grasp of these things. And it is a thing, isn't it, that people often find exoticness attractiveness too. So it's this sort of, almost this sort of out-group preference. Is that something you've seen?
I have not. I know the intuition you're talking about, and I'm not quite sure how to accommodate that. I mean, I guess averageness is not supposed to account for everything in physical attractiveness. So just sort of all things being equal, I guess. And there's a bit of I don't know. I'm not sure if people have studied an exoticness bias per se. In general, I mean, people don't like people who aren't in their groups. I will say that that's sort of a pretty robust relative to their in-group. So if people are asked to make almost any sort of value judgment about a person who is an in-group versus out-group, you find that you favor their in-group on all sorts of dimensions. So I'd be surprised if there was a sort of a general appeal of people outside your group.
Although perhaps from an evolutionary psychological perspective, we might expect it, even though that in-group bias generally exists in terms of mate selection, it's genetically better to choose somebody diverse than somebody too like you. Is it not?
It is, but I'm kind of an evolutionary psychology skeptic a little bit because. Right. Just because I think, yes, what you say is exactly right, and exactly the opposite of that also sounds right. When you there's also, from an evolutionary perspective, you'd think it would be really terrible for you to be be attracted to people outside of your group, and it takes you away from the safety of your in-group, and puts you at risk, and and it also goes against the sort of similarity, the sort of appeal of similarity and familiarity. And so I'm not saying that's what I had the same thought actually that you right before you said that there was an evolutionary reason, but I'm just sort of reluctant to sort of bring that out as the reason for anything.
I guess the word attractiveness itself can mean different things as well. I mean, you're not necessarily thinking about mate selection when you're rating the attractiveness of a face, but just how appealing it is. So I wonder, could it be context dependent? If you, I mean, do you ever get more specific than attractiveness and say, how much would you like to socially interact with this person, or would you choose this person as a mate? Or different ways of perhaps being attracted.
Would you swipe right on Tinder?
Yeah. For those of us who do those sorts of things.
I did this. I don't even know if we should talk about this study. Maybe this is too.
This is free Kiwis. You can talk about whatever you like.
To edit the part out, but I did. We did actually a long time ago. I did a study on attractiveness as a function of self-similarity.
I was wondering the same thing.
So people were. This is like a long time ago, so it wasn't that easy to do this morphing stuff. So we took we took people's photos. I'm trying to remember how we did this. We took people's photos. This was like with the first generation digital camera, so it had like an insertable sort of floppy disk that you had to take out. We'd like run down the hallway and try to morph it like with other faces to different degrees. And we had this prediction about the prediction anyway. I don't know how this. I can't remember how this thing came out, but the prediction was that you would have it's not advantageous to be attracted to very similar versions of yourself, right? But a certain amount of sort of genetic similarity is probably and it also makes a difference, like you're saying, whether you're talking about physical attractiveness or sort of like sort of someone you like, someone you want to help. So there should be sort of you should be more inclined to help people who are very similar to you, possibly as signaled by facial similarity, but you shouldn't be sort of physically attracted to those people. So I was sort of trying to get at the intuition you've got that there's sort of different meanings of attractiveness, and there's different sort of affective responses that kind of mean different things in different contexts. And you can see that diverging when you're talking about similarity to the self.
So attractiveness strikes me as a really good example of something which it sort of gets at the heart of a lot of debates in the academy at the moment, in that it's very much something that you can understand and you can see has both cultural and what you might call natural components. And my understanding, correct me if I'm wrong, is that there are studies that suggest that, if you go around different cultures, there are things which are pretty much universal in terms of attractiveness, that, symmetry and preference for younger mates or taller mates or higher status mates, depending on your sex. These things are found all over the world. Now, that seems to be true. And on the other hand, it also seems to be obviously true, or at least, there's obvious things that point in that direction, that there's also this cultural component. And I think maybe the most obvious instance of this is if you go back in time and look at paintings in the Baroque period or Renaissance period, it's the larger ladies who tend to be the examples of beauty, and that fashion seems to have changed. So how do we explain these things? Is it all cultural? Is it all natural? And you can explain these counterexamples away? Or is it some kind of mix of both?
Well, when you put it that way, it doesn't sound like that hard of a question, because
well then I'll make it even hard. I'll make it much harder for you. Tell me exactly the amount that it's natural and exactly the amount that it's cultural.
Yes, my calculations are that it's like 19.5% cultural. Well, no, these are bound to be, a mix of both. I think, even these distinctions are not really even, well, I guess they're useful kind of conceptually, but they're not that useful empirically. You get the same issue when you're talking about learning and nature and nurture, right? How much of these things are sort of inborn and how much are sort of learned, kind of a version of the same question. And it's bound to be, my view of, and I think evolutionary psychologists' view as well, or evolutionists' view would be that you're not selected for, or in many cases, what's selected for is sort of a template or something that's responsive to input from the environment. So it's like language, when you're not, we're being able to speak a language and learn a language like really efficiently when we're young is a feature that as natural selection has favored. But obviously we're not selected. English is not selected, or any particular language. It's like we're ready to be, we're ready to be exposed to something, and then we pick up
the telephone.
Yeah. Sorry, I'm getting rid of that.
Well, let me just try and make a brief argument in favor of sort of thinking in this way, which you said is very unscientific. But I think that there's a tendency to ask this question about nurture and nature, because I think it can have effects in the real world. One example from education is, if you believe that your capacities as a student are entirely cultural, you might have this environment where people say, you're just not trying hard enough. And that there may be a lot of truth to that, but there may be some point at which, you're just not good at math. I mean, I think for example, I was never going to have a PhD in mathematics. And so, you accept that. And on the other hand, if you think that everything is natural, you might just not do anything and not work at all. So, I think it probably does make a difference to how people act in the world, the extent to which they think these things have a natural or cultural component.
It occurs to me, actually, that if you think about fashion, that gives you some clues, because there are some bizarre fashions that arise in various cultures at various times, and those things can become the epitome of attractiveness in those contexts. For example, being able to put a lot of rings around your neck, or being heavily tattooed, or whatever it might be. Those things would not be universally attractive, but within those contexts, they can be exceedingly attractive. And that seems to be very much in favor of the in-group average kind of thing in a way, because even though people who do those things are not average by general human standards, they might be because everybody's doing that within their culture.
Mm-hmm. Well, I definitely agree that it matters what you call the thing. I mean, in that sense, it's really important whether people believe something to be innate or learned or cultural. So that does make a big difference. I guess I'm just saying in reality, I don't think there is, I don't think there will ever be an answer that it will never make sense really to say, whoa, that's just, that preference is just, innate, and not influenced by any kind of learning or context or culture. Because I think, like in the case of attractiveness, you were saying people were, what did you say? The larger ladies.
That's right. Well, go back and look at paintings in the 18th century and the ideals of beauty there.
Right.
Somewhat different than what people would say was the sort of cliche nowadays.
Yeah. So you might say, well, that just shows that it's totally cultural and, it doesn't matter, but on the other, you could say it's more like language, that when you're, that we're sort of attuned to environmental features, and there are people who explain those differences in terms of resources and signaling of wealth, and there's always I guess back to my other point, there's always a evolutionary account that will fit into that.
Right. So I guess another example of that, so what you're suggesting basically, one possible story you might tell about this is that, having lots of food, having lots of resources in the past would have been high status. And now it's become so easy to get that kind of resource that's low status. And another story we might tell along the similar lines is about, the Queen Elizabeth and the ladies of the court in the Renaissance, and all the male love poetry backs this up. It was extremely fashionable to be, very, very white skin, and they even used various sorts of lead-based makeup, which probably wasn't very good for them, to have this beautiful white face. And now it seems like having a tan is more in fashion. You can tell the story about it's more expensive in the old days to stay inside. Nowadays, it's more expensive to fly away and fly away on a holiday and lie on a beach, etc.
Yeah, exactly. It's sort of a signal for something. So it's not, but at a more abstract level, it's the signaling is the part that's, that is selected for, I guess.
Mm. Okay, maybe we should. That's all very interesting. Maybe we should segue though to this subject of cognition and emotion, but also just in general. I think we're very interested in sort of cognitive shortcuts or distortions. I mean, just a while ago, you said something. You said in general terms, there seems to be this in-group bias. So can you maybe talk more about that? How that affects the way that people think about themselves and others?
Well, that particular thing is there's sort of a very deep-seated, I won't say innate, but very, very deep-seated tendency to categorize. I mean, I'm really into categories, as you can see. Mm-hmm. So I think in-group and out-grouping is another sort of a especially, a significant case of social category or social categorizing. But people have a real tendency to sort of, to use like arbitrary distinctions and create groups out of them. So there's like a couple of really famous studies in social psychology they're not even really studies, they're more like kind of old demonstrations where people were where people have created groups, even hostile groups, from almost nothing really. There's this, Jane Elliott,
is that Blue Eyes, Brown Eyes?
Yeah, so Jane Elliott is someone that always in every social psychology textbook as an example. So so she sort of famously, divided her class into blue and brown-eyed kids, and basically just said like, well, today, blue-eyed kids are better, and it was sort of like, and the kids were like, okay, I'm happy to hate, brown-eyed kids now. And then like the next day was like, oh, sorry, it's actually wrong. It was the brown-eyed kids that were better, and okay, now blue-eyed kids are like on the have lower status. So anyway, ever since she sort of made that like, she's still around. I think she's like 90 years old.
Not sure that would get human ethics clearance nowadays, but
I don't think she did get human ethics clearance, and it had fairly messy results, as I recall. It wasn't a good outcome, was it, when she did that?
It's not. Yeah, well, it's not really even a study exactly.
No, it's not. No. But I'm interested in categories as well as a psychologist. I mean, it seems to me that if we're interested in any kind of cognitive psychology, whether it's the sort of more basic kind of cognition that I used to study in terms of object recognition, word recognition, and so on, or the more social oriented stuff that you do, you have to consider categories, because categories are actually units of meaning. If we didn't have categories, we'd have no way of actually distinguishing anything in the world, and we'd have no basis to ground our language, because the categories that we have words associated with them, which allow us to describe the world and discuss the world with our language. Now, when it comes to how we form categories, I guess there are natural ways in terms of things that actually form perceptual breaks when we process stimuli. And then there are, as you say, arbitrary ways where there's no real reason to make a distinction in a particular place, but we just do. And I think of color terms in that way to some extent. It's an interesting one because, as you're probably aware, Jamin, there different languages make different numbers of basic category color distinctions, and yet they tend to emerge in a fairly similar order as languages evolve over time, or as I'm actually not sure what it is that leads to the evolution of more color terms, but some languages have more than others, and it tends to be the ones there tends to be a kind of order in which they emerge. Would you agree with that? And that if so, that raises an interesting question about whether it's arbitrary or not, because if they emerge in a similar order, then it suggests that it's not exactly arbitrary.
Well, I'm sure you know that aren't the colors of the rainbow, right? Those are an arbitrary list, right? Aren't there 7 because the Greeks thought they should, or Greeks and Romans thought that there should be the same number of colors as planets or something like that?
Oh, I don't know. Perhaps something I should know.
But then when we look at a rainbow, we see the bands that correspond to the color terms we have in our language.
Or the other way around. I mean, do we
well,
see
perhaps, but the bands aren't really there in the stimulus, are they? What you've got is actually just a spectrum. So,
yeah, no, I wondered about that. It seems so intuitive when you look, or so obvious when you look at a rainbow, that, with the exception of indigo, and that's, I think, I'm not really sure what indigo is.
Yeah, that's what I was going to say. I'd never heard. I remember learning the word indigo precisely because it was in the acronym they taught us in England. Richard of York gave battle in vain for the colors. You know,
Roy G. Biv in the U.S.
What is it?
Roy G. Biv.
I think the Brits win that one. But anyway, yes. Sorry, we're interrupting you. Categories.
No, I was just saying. I mean, I don't know. I'm never able to really see indigo or distinguish it from blue. But that's. I thought indigo has been inserted into the spectrum in order to match.
Well, it's a good point, because indigo is a non-basic color term, whereas all the other rainbow colors are basic color terms. And interestingly, that's the one that you can't distinguish. So there has been, I mean, it's a pretty controversial area in some ways. I think that a lot of the empirical work is quite disputed, but I have definitely read studies which claim that when you have a color boundary, you actually exacerbate the perceptual difference across that boundary, as if somehow our language plays back onto the way we see things, which I find a fascinating idea.
Well, I think that's definitely true. I mean, you can. There's a good study by Goldstone, who's a guy I just happen to know because he was when I was at Indiana. I got my PhD at Indiana University. He was there then, so he's done work on categorical perception, where the same kind of idea, that not with colors, I don't think, but with line segments, and you align say you align six short vertical lines that are equally different in length. But if you put a label under a set of three, you call them the short lines, and you put the other one that's the long lines, you see like, oh, there's actually a difference between the two at the boundary of short and long. And I know there's a good study on people estimating the average temperature. I'm trying to remember how this goes. I think they estimate the average temperature each day, and they plotted those average temperatures across the calendar. And you find that there's these sort of disjunctions, or I guess breaks or non-linearities at the months. So when May turns into June, it gets colder.
Yeah.
Sort of perceptually, because it's a different month.
Because it's winter now.
Because it's the southern hemisphere. Southern hemisphere. So maybe we should get back to the social aspect of this then. So people, well, I guess what we were saying then is just sort of people look at the world partly through these categories that they already have, either that were socialized or naturalized. I know you don't like the distinction, but this is sort of like, this is something people have been thinking about since Kant and probably even before that. So how does this play into how we look at each other as human beings and as possible sort of friends or enemies?
Well, I mean, I guess what I was getting at was that with the sort of spontaneous use of categories and categorical perception, is that as soon as you sort of introduce a difference, people use that to distinguish their own group or themselves from an outgroup. So there's this famous paradigm called the minimal group paradigm, which like social psychologists like to use to sort of illustrate. I guess I sort of building on like these Jane. Sorry, what's her name again? Jane
Elliott.
Jane Elliott, right? Building on these sort of Jane Elliott.
You just taught me that.
Yeah, I know. I have a terrible memory. So building on those sorts of studies, asking, how little information is required before people will sort of sort themselves into groups. And they find that it's really nothing. It's just, you can make an arbitrary, even a random decision, have people draw, out of a bin that has, red balls and blue balls. And, you have people like draw a red ball or they draw a blue ball, and the people who draw the red balls, they like those people, each other better than the people, and they see themselves as distinct from the blue ball people, and in a positive way. So as soon as sort of, I guess there's like a real tendency to separate each other into groups. And once that's done, there's also sort of I don't know what to call it exactly, but people are inclined to positively distinguish the groups that they belong to from other groups, even if they're aware that those groups are sort of arbitrarily created or randomly created.
Right. And I guess it can be quite contextual as well and fluid. So, I think immediately of sports teams, even though I'm not a big fan of, big sport, but people support. I mean, I lived in Melbourne for a long time, where Australian rules football is huge, and people seem to have a team that they support from when they're very young and they support that team all their lives and they go along to the match and dress in the colours of the team and wave flags, and they're all very tribal about it. But it's only in the context of the football match that they have that in-group and out-group experience. And then after the match, they don't have, Australian football riots the way they do in Europe or England sometimes with soccer. There's no animosity between the fans of different teams as soon as the game's over. But while it's on, man, it's a bloodbath, verbally, not physically.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that is one of the sort of bright spots of this, I think, or positive messages of that research on the minimal group paradigm, and in sort of that's general. There's a theories called self-categorization theory or social identity theory. These are like big theories in British, Australasian social psychology, and about how people form groups and favor groups. But one of the aspects of that is that the what you're saying, the groups are fluid in a way. I mean, you belong to lots of different groups, and those group alliances can shift and change with context. So in a way, I guess I mean my feeling about groups is that and stereotypes and prejudice is that it's kind of inevitable, but solutions might include, I think you can shift like who the target of prejudice is. But never sort of eliminate the sort of desire for your group to be better than some other group.
Although perhaps we can downplay, or not, various characteristics as being important delineators. So, I mean, apart from Eliot's work, where she did this manipulation where she divided people according to their eye colour, people don't usually worry too much about what other people's eye colour is or discriminate against them because they've got the wrong coloured eyes, whereas we have much more unfortunate history when it comes to skin colour in that regard. And I guess, the liberal project of the late 20th century was to downplay that difference so that actually we don't make prejudicial judgments based on skin colour, because, it's the notion of colour blindness or whatever. Obviously, that's not literal. We'd still notice that some people have darker skin and others have lighter skin, but it wouldn't mean anything. I guess that's what that's driving towards, right?
No, I think that's true. I mean, I think that you can certainly do that. I guess my point is that something will take the place of my prediction. Something will take the place of skin color as a distinguishing feature. I mean, our kids, I thought this was amazing. Like when we came here, I mean, our kids were born here and grew up here, and like in contrast to where I grew up in the U.S., I mean, they really were color blind in the way you're talking about. I mean, if you ask them, if you like my son would, might be having a play date with someone. I mean, he's 17 now, but this is years ago. You might be having a play date with someone. You'd say like, oh, that's, John, what's John like? And he'd say, oh, John, he's like about my height, I don't know. He likes math and computers like me, and you'd meet him as like John would be like, Vietnamese or something. And you say, what? You didn't mention that he was, why didn't you mention that he was Vietnamese? That seems like an obvious, but for him, it's like that's not a category, of he doesn't see, I mean, he of course knows that, but he doesn't see that as a relevant feature. So I thought that was really kind of cool. But I also do think that there will be, for him, it's like, maybe it's math and, versus English majors or some other.
Or maybe it's going to be politics. I mean, because that's, there's this pretty widespread perception now that things are getting more tribal, particularly, sorry to say, in the States, and particularly around politics. And it's not unprecedented in the sense that as we've been talking about, we've had these category differences before, and we've had our ructions over them, and that's been in European history, and I'm sure in the rest of the world too. But you think of the 30 Years' War and things like that, it's been particularly pronounced in terms of religious identity. And even in our own lifetimes, the Northern Irish Troubles, that was all to do with Protestantism and Catholicism. And even though, in some sense it wasn't you can argue about whether that was really about religion and to what extent that was about these different tribes and different ways of speaking and different ways of identifying. But so now, so there's this wide perception that politics is becoming salient, and we have these new political tribes, and that this has been also exacerbated by these new technologies we have of the internet and social media. So is this something that you think is happening, and is there any way out of this?
Well, it's obviously happening. It's hard. I mean, I don't have this sort of historical perspective really to say whether things are actually worse now than they ever had been before. So I'm hesitant to say that. Certainly worse than in my lifetime that I can think of. But like you say, I think there probably have been the same instincts and same differences forever, but possibly exacerbated by social media advertising strategy. I mean, a thing that there's an interesting study that came out of I don't quite remember where this is published, possibly Religion, Brain, and Behavior, but I can't. But anyway, it was it looked at sort of the effect of I say like everybody needs somebody to dislike, but if everybody can if that sort of outgroupness can be sort of directed toward a neutral or harmless target, then it could be maybe like an outlet for that kind of intergroup distinction. So in this study, people were supposed to discuss the takeover of jobs by machines. So it was like this article about how there's this great threat from automation. So automation, and it's like automation and computers and AI. That's something that everybody, all humans can sort of
unite against.
Exactly. in opposition to. So, and they found that when people who thought, or I forget the manipulation exactly, but people who thought or wrote about this threat of automation showed lower prejudice beliefs about their human outgroups.
Right.
So that's interesting.
What we really need is an alien invasion.
That'd be great.
That would unite humanity.
I agree with you about social media. I think that's I mean, I can't say definitely, but it looks to me as if its dynamics have had a polarizing effect. But I also wonder whether there's a wider thing going on. So if we think about the last couple of 100 years, when democracy has become widespread throughout the world, and concomitant with that, we've had the idea that actually ideas should be discussed and debated, but we shouldn't kill one another over them, and we should actually try to get on with people who we disagree with politically, because actually we're part of the same societies and we need a balance of views, this kind of thing. It occurs to me that that's actually an historical anomaly in many ways, that we actually have a situation like that, and that's actually quite hard to achieve and possibly even harder to maintain. And so, setting aside social media, which I do think has had an effect, I wonder if we've just lost the plot a bit on what we need to do to maintain that kind of democratic idea that ideas are to be discussed rather than to cross swords over.
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, it's. Yeah, I don't know. I'm not sure. I don't know whether to attribute that to social media or not. Whether that. But I agree that yeah. I mean, among people that I know, it's all just anecdotal stuff. But yeah, among people I know, family and people, friends overseas, especially. There's much less sort of, accommodation, I guess, or sort of putting yourself in other people's shoes, and much more of a categorical belief that someone's just not even worth listening to, really.
Right, and I mean, you're a member of Heterodox Academy. We both are as well, and it's arguable that this is sort of what's happening in the academy, right? Because there have been various studies of political affiliation within academic staff or faculty over time, and you can see already in the 60s and 70s that it tended to be that people on the left were in academia, the academics were on the left. And, the ratios, if you go back to the 70s and 80s, were sort of 2-1, 3-1, 4-1, and now we're getting, in the humanities at least, we're getting to sort of 22-1 or 17-1, things like that. In some fields, I think like economics, we're still around 4-1, but those are now the outliers in terms of the fields.
Yep.
So, and I've heard, we had John Haidt on the previous to you on this podcast, and I mean, I've heard him say things like, it's not a problem in itself that these groups, that academics tended to lean to the left. And I would agree with that, but then if you add in this tendency that we've been talking about, for people to sort of have an out-group, and you add in how politics seems to be becoming more salient as a marker of identity, then we seem to have a formula where anybody who's not on the left or sharing a particular set of views gets, identified with the outgroup, and then there are various things that seem to flow from that. Is that a picture you recognize? Is that a concern of yours, or did you join Heterodox Academy for some completely different reason?
I'm trying to. I can't remember why I first joined. I remember reading about it and thinking that those kind of ideals of sort of free speech and really kind of resonated with me. I mean, I have since had some run-ins, but with Twitter mobs and things, but nothing that's I think nothing like the worst cases that John Haidt talks about when he speaks. I really haven't, to be honest. I really haven't encountered that much here at Otago. I have found it pretty, open and welcoming to ideas. But to be fair, I don't think it's really, people are really pushed that hard. There's a fairly homogeneous, political beliefs here, I think. So I would be interested to see what happens if we did have a truly, controversial person, touting.
I get the sense that this kind of cancel culture or whatever has entered New Zealand in a slightly different way than it arose originally in the United States. I mean, it seems to me that the kind of tacit censoring of ideas or banning of speakers or whatever, such as it has been in New Zealand, has come from the administration. I mean, in the case of Massey, it came from the Vice Chancellor herself. Whereas in the US, it seemed to originally arise from the students taking issue with various things and pushing hard to have speakers banned or shut down. So I wonder if that's got something to do with the fact that, I, like you, haven't found my colleagues to be particularly like that, even though I know some of them have got very different political views to me. It seems I have good relationships with them and it seems to be all right. Whereas if I was in the US, it might be quite different.
And just maybe it's partially just the climate too. That, politics here is not, it's just not as, to me, it seems not as all encompassing, It's like we do other things besides like run campaigns and elect people. People do get, passionate, I guess, but still, even at their most passionate, it seems pretty polite by American standards, and it's fine. It's like nice to be able to like live your life without like everything being like what's going to happen in the midterms or something.
Yes.
So maybe that's part of it. It's like holding a political view is not, at least in general, like holding a non-standard or outline political view doesn't have the same kind of implications for who you are as a person, and it can be sort of relatively more self-contained, I guess.
It's curious. Like I think that if I think about the times when I've heard sort of people phoning into talkback radio and getting really passionate about politics and using really kind of intemperate language, it's often been Kiwi politics junkies who latch onto American politics. It's really interesting. It's almost like politics here is so sort of staid that there's nothing to get too excited about. So then they tap into the sort of Trump and anti-Trump stuff in the States, and it's kind of this weird effect as if they're, it's just like sometimes when you meet North Americans who are really into the English Premier League, and they get really passionate about Liverpool, and you think, you've never been to Liverpool. Not that they're not allowed, but I mean, it's that kind of effect. And you think, well...
Taking on somebody else's tribalism.
Yeah, exactly. But then it kind of worries me because it's sort of like the capacity for this tribalism from the States, and not that I'm trying to make Americans into an out-group, but you know what I mean? Like that kind of tribalism, the capacity for that to spread seems almost unbounded at this point, at least in the English-speaking world.
Yeah, I mean, I do worry about that, whether New Zealand is just, sometimes people say, oh, New Zealand is like follows like trends of like North America by, behind 20 years. I always hated that implication that like New Zealand was just, sort of lagging behind in some way of, but it did occur to me with that sort of model that, are we on the cusp of our own Trump or of our own sort of, extreme politics.
Well, our political dynamics are very different. We have a very different political system. I think the American presidential system is partly to blame for the rise of that kind of leader or that kind of person who appeals to a certain populist sentiment or something like that. I think New Zealand is probably less susceptible to that. I do think there's truth in the contention that New Zealand follows overseas trends because we're a small country that has traditionally been quite culturally influenced, first by Great Britain and more recently by America, even Australia. But I also think that it's not that simple because actually when the ideas land here, they get morphed into a New Zealand version and things are not quite the same and they don't necessarily play out in the same way as they would in America or Australia.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah, that's why. I mean, I don't think anything's inevitable. It just worries me on occasion when I see glimpses of students, entitlement or students, pushing back. I mean, I had a student in my class. I tried to run my seminar at like kind of pushing the heterodox sort of academic worldview, I guess. Like I try to say, I try to like have every class be a bit of a, I do some lecturing and then we also like tackle some kind of controversial issue, that the content, the social psychological content like ties into in some way. And it was fun. I mean, I thought no one, I think people enjoyed it. Some people said they enjoyed it, but I also had a few students afterwards, like write anonymously to say like, I really didn't feel safe in this thing. And I didn't know I was going to get in for this. I wish I'd been warned ahead of time what this was all about, and I mean, to be fair, I mean, they did have a point as well, but,
what were they actually objecting to?
This didn't get me in even more trouble. No, but I was asking. It was actually about categories again. I was asking like why some categories are are much more passionately held self-categorizations. Like that if you were, and I think I said it. Well, if you were a doctor, a medical doctor, and someone said, mistook you for a lawyer, right? That wouldn't offend you, I don't think, right? But if you were, if you were, female and mistaken for male, or misgendered, or you even get your name wrong or something. I mean, that's these things seem much more personal. I'm not saying they shouldn't be. I'm just saying it seems interesting that some kinds of ways that we categorize ourselves are like absolutely sort of sacred, and then others are like,
sometimes literally sacred. I mean, I suppose one might take pride, for example, in being a good Christian or a good Muslim. You wouldn't take pride in being a good person with blue eyes. I mean, unless you're in Nazi Germany or something, but that's an outlier. But normally you don't take pride in being weighing 80 kilos or being in a set of people.
There's no moral dimension to those things, whereas being a good Christian or Muslim has moral expectations that come with it. Yeah. But there is another, I mean, it puts me in mind of something Richard Dawkins said recently that got him in trouble, which is nonetheless a very good question. So if we take the sort of modern or contemporary identity politics situation whereby people can freely identify with whatever gender, male, female, or something else, and that's something that we all ought to accept. On the other hand, if you tried to identify with a different race, you'd get into all sorts of difficulty, and that wouldn't be acceptable at all. And it's actually completely unclear why. Because, I mean, you might argue, well, you shouldn't identify with the category that's less privileged than yours because you're appropriating their culture or their worldview or whatever. But it's okay for a man to identify as a woman, which, historically has been seen as women have been disadvantaged relative to men. So it's very, very unclear what the principle is that distinguishes those two situations.
That's really interesting. I'll bring that up as a discussion point next year, I think.
In your class, that should go really well. Yeah.
Yeah, might be I'm teaching it, but
well, we're meant to be. We're meant to be asking questions. It's our vocation, and I think these are good questions to ask. And, we should be allowed to do that in an open way.
Yeah, no, that is a really interesting point, I think, and I guess that's kind of the kind of general sentiment or general idea I was trying to get at as well. That what distinguishes these categorical distinctions that we make, and why are some held more passionately than others, are seen as more intrinsic, or inviolable than others. But yeah, it is complicated to be fair. In fact, one thing I learned, I think, in my class this year, we talked a lot about sort of freedom of speech, I guess, or really about publication standards, this was in the context of publication. So we covered like a few cases where social psychology articles have been retracted for different reasons, and whether that's warranted, and is there any case where actually publishing this stuff is dangerous in any typical use of that word. That's the basis on which some of these things have been retracted, that this is it's harming if you say this, this thing,
even if it's demonstrably true.
Yeah, even.
And what did your students think about that?
They're on the whole, they felt like if it's true, and you take appropriate precautions, I guess, then it should be published.
What kind of precautions are they talking about?
This happened to me. I don't know. Shouldn't get into this. This happened to me at something that I was an editor on. I didn't publish this myself, but it was retracted for. I don't want to get into the merits of the retraction, but the editor, the senior editor-in-chief, published a sort of an editorial to go along with the retraction, and the editorial focused on how really regardless of the merits of this particular article, you really need to be careful when you're publishing things that can potentially harm others, that have messages that would potentially harm others. So they should be accompanied by sort of contextual commentary, I guess, to let people know that, I guess I guess you should publish make sure you publish a counterpoint, I guess, to say that, this isn't necessarily true. But of course I had a problem with that, because I thought, if you only publish commentaries and counterpoints to the things that offend you, that obviously you're skewing the evidence.
Yeah, keep going.
Oh, so anyway, but actually the students, some of the students had good points. I wasn't, I went in sort of thinking, well, you should just publish everything and let everybody sort it out for themselves, and there's absolutely no harm to be had by anything that you say, but I think that's probably not quite right. When you see, if you take a serious view of psychology as a causal force, that people, that when you say things happen psychologically to other people, and that there can be effects. I don't think I wouldn't rule out the possibility that there are things that people can say that would have like actual measurable harmful effects on others.
Perhaps, but maybe we should be, working on making ourselves resilient and robust to that, rather than going down the path of making what will end up being arbitrary decisions on what could be said and what couldn't. I mean, I guess anything could potentially harm someone if they had a particular phobia or a particular anxiety, but...
Well, not only that, I think that you touched upon something really quite important here, which is that this harm argument actually is often plausible. So it's not that it's not plausible, it's just that it's so often plausible that if we start using the harm argument to shut down speech, we're going to shut down a lot of speech. Okay, there's probably some amount of speech and expression that just is completely anodyne and has no possible claim to harming people. But a lot of political discussions, a lot of moral positions and religious positions, other people think that they're harmful. I mean, this is why people started killing each other over different denominations in Christianity, because the Catholics thought the Protestants were doing harm to people's souls, and the Protestants thought the Catholics were doing harm to people's souls. And, we look back at some of that stuff, at least the violence involved, and think it's a bit silly, but that's often the case with political discussions, that each side is making claims that the other side is going to do something which is going to harm people. And so the problem now, I think, with the political slant is just that it's very asymmetrical, the way that these things are dealt with. So, for example, I was in a Wellington cafe recently, and you go into the loo and there's graffiti, big graffiti, someone's written, "All police are bastards." And so I understand there are people who think the police could be doing better, and there's brutality and so on and so forth. But it's perfectly possible that someone might take the following view: this is harmful because actually the police aren't bastards. Actually, the police are just our brothers and fathers, and they're members of our community. And if you put out the message that they're bastards, then maybe people will throw bottles at them, and that's going to cause them harm. And then maybe the police will get more shy, and that's going to increase the crime rate. So anything like that, you can tell a very plausible story about harm. And then the question is just, what do we do with that? Does one side get to force the other people to shut up because they can sort of enforce these fears about harm? Or do we just sort of have a social contract where we say, okay, let's just say that we can talk about anything and put forward these claims of harm, and then we only act when we've convinced enough people, maybe a majority, that this is the way we should go. That seems like the better way to me.
No, I agree kind of in principle, but then you get these sort of extreme cases. Like would do you think the Christchurch terror attacks ought to be available for open viewing? And
I'm very, very ambivalent about the video. I had absolutely no desire to watch that myself, and I can see no real public interest being served in it being available. The manifesto is a different case. I don't think that should have been censored, because I think actually, if anything, it would be a net benefit to have that available so that people could understand, to the extent that it's possible to understand, what motivated that act, because we need to understand why people do things like that in order to make sure that it doesn't happen.
Yeah, but you can see you're already drawing some distinctions that are potentially arbitrary. I don't particularly think it should be the video should be available, but I guess I'm just saying that seems like a case where most people agree, yeah, let's not make that available.
Well, I guess the video is not an expression of an idea. It's a record of something that happened. And I guess the reason that it's banned is because it's horrific, and there's an element of respect to the victims and their families of not having that available for people to perhaps take prurient interest in. So, I mean, I guess I don't feel ultra strongly about it. I tend to be against censorship in general, but it's hard for me to see what good could be served by having that available, whereas something like Brenton Tarrant's horrible ideas that he put in that manifesto, I do think there is a very clear benefit to us knowing what went through his mind.
Yeah, but I think people would say the same. Plenty of people, I'm sure, would say the same thing about the manifesto too. That is very disrespectful to the the group. It's like only going to, some people will understand better. Other people are going to like get new ideas that they never had before. And, I guess I'm just saying, like, I agree with you in general. I'm like very uncomfortable with like censoring things, but then I do, there are these occasional cases where I think, well, I can kind of see like why that would be useful not to have available.
Okay, well, here's another thing though. I think that it's interesting you say that, because that's an argument that's made often, and it seems to proceed as follows. I'm not sure this is exactly the line that you're taking, but I often hear this, that people say, well, you say, well, look, there's a problem with freedom of speech in academia or whatever, and they say, well, you wouldn't allow someone to say X, and often it's quite an extreme case. And then the argument, the form of the argument is something like, well, that shows that you're not in favor of free speech in every single case. Therefore, what's the problem if we, usually then there's this slide to, okay, then what's the problem with censoring Jamin's article or whatever it is. And so to me, that's a little bit of I don't know what the correct term for it is, but it's sort of a distraction in a way, because often what we're talking about in these situations, I mean, if you think about things like the Rebecca Tuvel article, where she was making a similar argument that Michael was playing with earlier about, can you sort of identify as a different race? And that was retracted. So that is not a video of horrific murder, like in the Christchurch video case, right? So that's what we're really talking about. We're really talking about whether, who's that guy in Oregon who makes, the case for colonialism, things like that. Can you make historical arguments defending colonialism? Can you make arguments that, sex is natural, things like that? That's what we're talking about. So, and I feel very comfortable defending all of those things. And I'm not convinced by the argument that because there are these extreme cases where even thoroughgoing classical liberals and libertarians will sort of start to doubt themselves, that we have to sort of compromise on these other areas.
Yeah, no, I would agree. I guess my point is just that it's a matter of argument, I guess. I mean, I guess I was just pointing out that I had a more categorical view of this situation before I sort of started talking about, with students, I think, and tried to see like, what is it that you see as harmful about these things? Not with regard to the Christchurch events, just this was more with regard to, usually with regard to race and gender identity.
I think it's definitely true that there's a different perspective on average in their generation than there is perhaps in ours, and it does behoove us to try to understand that. I guess my take is that I do want to help them to become more resilient and more able to, confront things that make them feel anxious rather than to have to hide from them, because I think that's better for them and it's better for our culture in the long run. But
yeah. Well, I mean, the reason I think it's important is because, like, in social psychology, there's a phenomenon called Latitude Inoculation, which is basically, exposure to weak forms of argument that you've never considered before. So it's like studies where in these original studies they like challenged people on things that were just taught, just truisms as far as they were concerned, like you should brush your teeth every day or something. They said, actually, well, you really thought about that? Actually, brushing your teeth every day actually is not so, it can wear out your gums. And would you really need to have is it really necessary to have people didn't brush their teeth every day, hundreds of years ago. And anyway, so they just sort of presented these not great arguments, but arguments at least that made people think, and asked people to sort of think about those, defend those, rebut those. And those sorts of people were much more sort of resilient to, genuine, real attacks on their attitudes. And I just worry about how, even things that everybody sort of especially things that everybody agrees about, have just never been sort of really defended in any way. And even if it's just, that seems like a real valuable skill to be able to have some actual substance behind your beliefs so that why it is you believe them, I guess. And
I think maybe the final thing that I'll say it's maybe that bothers me about the harm argument, and this might tie in with some of the stuff you were saying before about categories, and the way that we have this tendency to identify an in-group and look at outsiders as sort of worse in some ways. And it's just that you can always, if you're having a deep-seated agreement about something, you can very often attribute a desire for harm to the opposite party. And sometimes that may be true. I'm not going to rule it out a priori, but it's usually the case in my experience that people who are making certain political or religious arguments are doing so not because they think they're going to lead to harm, but because they think they're going to lead to good. So there's a way in which it's a lack of charity, really, that, you're having a conversation, say about policing, and you say, I think we should, defund the police, or at least, severely cut them back. And the other person says, oh, I think the police actually, they do some good. They have a hard time. It's a difficult job. And, you could just say, well, that means that you're happy with people being murdered, or you're happy with, police brutality. But of course, they could also say, well, you're some kind of crazy anarchist and you want to ruin society. And that's obviously not a recipe for a productive conversation, right? So it actually can help if you move away from this harm argument and just maybe assume the other person is also trying to do more or less what you're doing, which is usually maybe there's some motives within everybody that aren't admirable, but often there are also sort of, quite socially praiseworthy motivations when people make arguments in the public sphere.
Yeah, I would agree. I think that's a good point. If you start with the presumption that everybody has sort of the same general goals as you with regard to people's well-being, and there's sort of a general kind of shared morality, I guess, that's innate, that if you start with that presumption, it might be easier to see where people are coming from. I don't know. I think it's a good exercise in general, even if you don't assume that, just sort of try to sort of argue from someone else's perspective.
It displays a degree of intellectual humility, if nothing else, and also moral humility. It's like you're not the custodian of what's good any more than they are, and actually, maybe we're all trying to search for what's good, and to the greatest extent we can, what's true. So.
Yeah.
Perhaps that's a good note on which to end. We're coming up to the. In fact, this is quite a long episode of Free Kiwis. We're coming up to.
That's right.
Yeah, it's been a fascinating conversation with you, Jamin, and we've traversed quite a lot of ground. And thank you very much for joining us today.
No, thank you. It's been really fun just to chat about this.
That's what we do.
Hopefully, we won't get in any more trouble.